I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow. Hello, NeuFit Nation. In this episode, I wanted to put together one coherent episode talking about my training philosophy and a nervous system first framework for training. There's things that I'll share with you here that I've certainly talked about in other episodes of this podcast or in my appearances on other people's podcasts. Also, we'll be referencing a lot of the content that's in chapters 6 and 7 of my book, The NeuFit Method. And so there will be things that you've heard in other places. I hope that having it here in one coherent place, along with probably some new perspective mixed in as well, will be useful. So let's dive in here. One of the biggest frameworks that I want to share with you to set the stage for this is the pyramid of performance. And there's an image of this in chapter 7 of my book. And if you're just listening, you can envision a pyramid where you have a baseline level and then you build on top of that and it gets progressively narrower. And the wider and more stable the foundation, of course, the higher you can build that pyramid. And so I like to think about this process of increasing performance, athletic performance, whether it be in hockey, baseball, basketball, soccer, golf, tennis, dance, gymnastics, etc. Think about it from this framework. So first, we need a baseline level of movement proficiency. That means being able to use in a coordinated manner all of the joints and muscles of your body throughout all the requisite ranges of motion. And that forms the foundation. And then from there, building on top of that, we want to have the stamina or the endurance and the energy systems to fuel that movement for long enough to be able to play games and practices and get through a whole season and recover in between all these bouts, right? And then on top of that, we can build strength and speed. I keep those at the same level because there's a strength-speed continuum where some activities are more speed or velocity focused with lower strength component, whereas others, think like throwing a baseball, right, where it's very fast and a very light implement, whereas powerlifting, lifting something very heavy, but is going to move more slowly, is on the other side of that at that strength speed level. And then on top of that, finally, at the top of the pyramid is sport specific skill. And many people go to sport specific skill without developing the requisite parts of the pyramid that support that skill. And so you'll often hear coaches talking about, kids specializing too early in their sport and playing too many games and not spending enough time in experiencing other sports. So they get a diversity of movement proficiency and spend enough time building some of these general athletic traits. So that there's a lot of truth in that. And from everything I've read, it seems like if one is going to specialize in a certain sport, at least waiting until puberty is a good idea so that you can get all of these prerequisite neurological patterns of coordination and connective tissue and bone growth plate structure, all the anatomy exposed to as diverse as possible of a set of movements to develop as much proficiency as possible, at least before puberty. So that's a good guideline there. But generally speaking, we like using this framework of the pyramid to think about how to approach development for long-term sustainable high performance. And another framework that I want to incorporate here as we set off on this journey together is the SAID principle, SAID, for specific adaptation to imposed demand. And what that tells us is that we're always adapting to whatever it is that we're doing. And this can be, of course, positive or negative, right? I can adapt in a positive manner just the same as I can adapt in a negative manner. So one of my favorite examples of the quote unquote negative manner of adaptation is to think about someone who's a stereotypical desk jockey. If you can see me, you can see I'm hunched over as if I'm at a computer with that sort of hump in my thoracic spine. If you're just listening, envision it yourself, being hunched over like that all day long. The specific adaptation to imposed demand, that principle tells us that I'm adapting, I'm getting better at doing that very thing. And so guess what? After that 8-hour day of being in that position, I have now earned the right to be in that position all day long, the rest of the day, and to be able to do that more easily for months and years in the future. Of course, if that's not an adaptation that you want, which I don't know who would necessarily desire to do that, then we want to be aware of the position that we're in so that those positional adaptations can be more positive over time. And there's also an offshoot of this, or a related framework to this SAID principle, which is that I really like to think of the nervous system collectively, the brain, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, we'll just call all that the nervous system. I like to think of that as if it is a muscle that can be trained. We know that you can go to the gym and you can challenge your muscles and they can build up and get bigger and stronger. They adapt over time so they can better meet challenges in the future when they're used, in a manner where you have progressive overload and they get challenged over time. Same thing with the nervous system. The nervous system can adapt, and it does that by upregulating activity at synapses. It does that by laying down more myelin around the pathways that are most commonly used. And it takes a lot of energy and resources to do that. And so it's really important that we stimulate the particular nervous system pathways that we wish to be stimulated, that we do that intensely enough or significantly enough and frequently enough over time so the body gets the point that it's worth investing the energy and resources to build up and maintain those pathways, because it takes energy to fuel those sodium and potassium pumps and send action potentials down the nerves, right? So there's a lot of underlying activity going on. It takes energy to support all that communication network. So the SAID principle here, and thinking about the nervous system like a muscle. And then related to this, I want to think about ways to increase the level of neurological challenge in certain activities. So take something like jogging, for example. Imagine that you're jogging on a treadmill. So there's no change in the surface, right? It's very steady. The speed is moderate. There are certainly health benefits to this, cardiovascular system. You're getting some loading on your muscles and tendons and bones, and it's certainly better than nothing, right? And now think about doing that same pace of jogging, but doing it outside on a trail. Think about how much more neurologically stimulating it is, because you have the added challenge of, gradient up and down. You have unstable surface. If you're on a trail, you might have to navigate around rocks and things like that. So there's a lot more nervous system processing and activity and challenge that you have to do. So that can be a way to upgrade the neurological challenge of that activity. You can also increase the speed, right? So that could mean working in some sprint intervals. You could you could run at a higher pace for 400 meters, a lap around the track, or you could run at an even higher pace for 50 to 100 meters. And so there's times where working in some of these faster sprints certainly has value for different people in different circumstances. And the point here is that we want to think about ways to take an activity and safely and effectively increase the level of neurological challenge or neurological stimulation. So we got these frameworks so far. We have this performance pyramid, and then we have the SAID principle, which plays into neuroplasticity and this idea that the nervous system can be trained in a similar fashion as a muscle can be trained. So now I want to talk about some actual techniques that I like, that I use, that I recommend, that are more nervous system focused when it comes to training. And they play off of these frameworks that we have just talked about here. So we'll segue now into some actual techniques where the rubber meets the road. And the first one I want to talk about is what I like to call end range activation, or ERA activities. These sometimes can be called, in some circles, long duration isometrics, or sometimes extreme joint angle isometrics. And I think that these were initially popularized, maybe there's other sources too, but initially popularized by a guy named Jay Schroeder, a strength coach who achieved some fame in the early 2000s for the unique training methods he used with an NFL safety named Adam Archuleta, who also achieved some fame for setting NFL combine records as a safety. You know, he had one of the best, if not the best, vertical jumps, 225-pound bench press rep max, the number of reps he could do there. I think, you know, he made a splash at the combine, and that achieved some notoriety for some of these methods. And I think that's how I got interested in it in the first place. In my, you know, late teens, early 20s, it was an interesting segue for me. And so I definitely, you know, learned a lot from Jay over the years. I want to give credit where credit is due. It was also a case of, you know, take what you like and leave the rest, which I recommend for everybody, where there were things that I liked and also ways that I thought it could be, you know, changed or improved and such. And then, you know, in terms of where some of this comes from, I also, inspiration from interactions with Jay, was inspired to learn a lot about the Soviet sports science. So I read, for example, Super Training, the big, you know, it's a book, but really more like an encyclopedia by Mel Siff and Yuri Verkhoshansky, and read, you know, ordered and found, tracked down dozens of issues of Soviet training journals that were translated by Dr. Michael Yesis, a PhD sports scientist here in the US, who's Russian by birth and could translate a lot of these Soviet journals because he spoke Russian. So I'll share a picture on social media of some of these resources here. But, you know, going through and doing a deep dive of all these got me really excited and passionate about this type of training and this framework that we're talking about here today. So end range activation. What I really like about these is that they allow us to simultaneously train mobility and neuromuscular coordination and strength and endurance and mental toughness, emotional resilience. I would say even a spiritual component. So there's a lot happening in these, and I want to go through each of those one by one to touch on each of these points, because I think it'll be clarifying, perhaps even inspiring to talk about it. So first, let's look at mobility. So I say end range activation. That means we're trying to go to the end range, go as far into a movement as possible, whether it's pulling down to the bottom of a push-up, which, you know, of course, if you're on the floor, for most people, you go down to the bottom, your chest will hit the floor. So you might have to elevate on handles or kettlebells or between chairs or benches or stuff like that, so you can pull down all the way there. You know, hanging in the bottom of a pull-up, just, you know, hanging at the bottom there can be one. Or it can be in a lunge or Bulgarian split squat type of position. Or you can be in a 90-90 sitting like shin box position where you're really emphasizing internal rotation of one of the legs there. You know, there's different ways to achieve, of course, end ranges of motion. The key is that you're actively pushing or pulling into this position, because when you look at mobility, there's two parts. There's a neuromuscular part and then there's a connective tissue part. For the neuromuscular part, it's important to understand that our brains will, you know, want us to first and foremost survive, live to see tomorrow. In light of that, one of the highest priorities for the brain is to prevent us from getting injured, right? Because if we're injured, we're more vulnerable to attack and being eaten. And so our brains don't want us to stretch too far, because we could tear apart some of our tissues and be very vulnerable. So we have these stretch reflexes that create tension to prevent us from going past a certain range of motion that the brain perceives as safe. And so if we learn to activate our muscles at the end range, and then we gradually expand that, go a millimeter further, our nervous systems learn that we actually can be safe in that position, because we're not just bracing against the connective tissue of the cartilage, ligaments, tendons, etc. We're actually have some muscular control and active stability there, so that it is sending the signal that we're safe, we're not as vulnerable there. And that allows us not only to increase range of motion over time, but to maintain any new range of motion, because the brain will understand that it's safe there. And so this is a very powerful framework, this end range activation, very powerful framework for working on mobility. But oftentimes when we think mobility, it's, you know, the thought of like, oh, this is just some kind of extra maintenance work that I have to do at the beginning or end of a session or at night before bed, and it's not challenging enough. It's just like an added thing to do. And so one of the reasons I like this end range activation is that we're getting the mobility at the same time as we're getting these other benefits. So it doesn't necessarily feel like another thing to have to add on. And there's also, then the other component, as we talk about the neuromuscular part, there's also the connective tissue part of this. And that, going back to the example of the desk jockey who's hunched over at the computer all day long, not only do the nerves and muscles get used to activating in that position, but the connective tissue is more passive and it just responds to the ranges in which it's being used. And so the fascia is going to shorten on the front in this example and lengthen along the back and sort of get locked in those positions. And if we use it or lose it really applies here. If we don't take our connective tissue through the full range of motion, like for example with our shoulders, if we don't bring our arms overhead or behind us, if they're only in front of us because we're typing, eating, driving a car, eventually that both neurologically and mechanically in terms of connective tissue, the range available to us is going to shrink and narrow, in large part because of what we talked about earlier, because the body doesn't want to waste energy to maintain extra function, extra tissue, extra nervous system signaling to support extra ranges that we're not using. It's not worth it, right? We want to conserve energy in case there's a famine tomorrow. So also being able to work on the connective tissue component, that takes load at a end range of motion. I think there's some research that shows that you want at least 2 minutes of loading in a certain position in order to get those mechanical connective tissue adaptations. And so this end range activation gives us the time to be able to get into those positions for long enough so you can also, in addition to the neuromuscular component, you can get that connective tissue adaptation component. So there's mobility there, but that's not all. There's also a strength component to this, because if you're activating a position, if you're actively pushing or pulling into position, you're having to use the shortening muscles at their shortest range of motion. And that's where there's the least amount of reflexive feedback, because there's no stretch reflex activation. Those muscle spindles, those muscle spindles have the most slack on them. So there's the least amount of this reflexive spinal cord level activity. So you have to send the greatest amount of descending central activation from the brain down to those muscles. So you have to really activate that pathway as much as you can. And remember, the nervous system is like a muscle that can get better too. So you actually get better at that skill of sending that signal down, sending a stronger signal down from the brain to that pathway in the spinal cord to activate that pool of motor units so that you can engage more motor units at that point in time. So you can actually increase strength as you're doing this. You can also increase endurance. And I think that's probably easy to understand, that if you're, people do like wall sits, you're familiar with, or horse stance in martial arts. Those are, gets to be challenging when you're in that position. For some people, it's 30 seconds or a minute. Some people, it gets challenging at 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. And you really start to burn. It starts to get very, very challenging. And so you're challenging your energy systems. You have a lot of fatigue setting in, and being able to work through that, of course, is a way to increase endurance. Here, it's more local muscular endurance than it is cardiovascular endurance, but there's certainly a component of both. I don't want to necessarily say that this would get everything that you need, but there's a strong component of that. It is more local muscular endurance with how the muscles themselves are going to use lactic acid as a fuel source and anaerobic glycolysis and all of these energy systems, energy substrates. So there's a component there. There's also an interesting dynamic around coordination patterns, especially intermuscular. We talked a moment ago about sending the signal down from the brain, descending central signal to activate a muscle. That's intramuscular coordination, being able to engage as much motor units in that target muscle. And then intermuscular coordination is being able to coordinate the contraction of one muscle as the antagonist relaxes. And this is really interesting, because here, if you're pulling into position in a squat or lunge, for example, you're by pulling into position, you're actually you're actually stimulating eccentric elongation of the muscles that are working to hold you up. So if I'm pulling down into a lunge, for example, with my left leg forward, as I pull that left leg down, I'm contracting, I'm creating knee flexion with my hamstring, I'm creating hip flexion with my hip flexor. And so my glute as the hip extensor, my quad as the knee extensor, those are lengthening eccentrically as they hold me up. Of course, they're working, but they're working eccentrically. And it's worth taking a moment just to touch on this, because a lot of times we think that muscles either contract or relax, but they're actually always contracting. It's just a grade of how much tension they're creating. So when a muscle lengthens, it's still contracting. It's just eccentrically contracting, meaning it's creating tension to protect itself, but it's yielding. It's not creating so much tension that it overcomes the load. It yields and allows that tissue to lengthen, but there's still tension. There's still eccentric contraction. And so in a let's talk about a squat rather than a lunge, just so it's both legs are doing the same thing, a little easier to conceptualize. So if you're pulling down with those hip flexors, you're actively engaging. You're not just sitting there, like a resting position. Although resting position in a squat, ton of value there. That's awesome too, just slightly different. So if you're actively pulling down with your hip flexors and you're actively using your hamstrings to flex your knee, then your quads, especially, rec fem, of course, is a hip flexor as well, but your vastus medialis, vastus lateralis are knee extensors. And so they're eccentrically lengthening. Your glute max is eccentrically lengthening there. The muscle is working. It's not shut off, because if it was shut off, you just fall to the ground. So it's obviously working. The key is that it's working eccentrically. In a push-up, if you pull with the muscles of the upper back, your pecs are still working. They're just working eccentrically, because if they weren't working, again, you'd fall to the ground. So an interesting nuance there in terms of understanding and clarifying the notion of contraction versus relaxation, and how that really is eccentric versus concentric contraction. So with that said, going back to this intermuscular coordination theme, when you're pulling down with those, with the upper back to really lengthen the pectoral muscles in the chest, when you're pulling into position in that push-up, in that ERA push-up, one of the things that you're doing is training the ability of your muscles to get very comfortable and skillful at eccentrically elongating. And that's important because if you look at speed, look at athletic performance. So there's one of these Soviet journals that I read. There was an article by a guy named Vysochin, who was a Soviet sports scientist, and he did an amazing study to discover that the biggest limiting factor that influenced an athlete's ability to go from being effective regionally versus nationally versus internationally competitive at the Olympics, biggest factor, he looked at all different factors. They thought it was going to be strength, and strength turned out to be number 2, and that is, relative strength to body weight. But number 1 was the ability not to contract, but the ability to go from a fully contracted muscle to a fully relaxed muscle quickly. It was how quickly they could relax their muscles. Because think about the opposite. If they can't relax their muscles, if an athlete can't relax his or her muscles quickly, they're going to be resisting their own movements and slowing it down. Like driving a car with the throttle, you're hitting the throttle and the brake pedal at the same time, right? You're not going to go as fast as if you just take your foot off the brake. So being able to relax muscles quickly, and of course we know relax now means eccentrically contract. So you practice this skill of eccentric contraction. You also set up this dynamic of sort of like a bow and arrow, where you're pulling into position like you're loading a bow, and you create a lot of potential that when you go to release that, you end up having a lot of stored up potential that can be converted into force and kinetic energy. So you train this coordination pattern that is really effective for driving movement. And there's a really cool tidbit here. One of the things from that super training book that I read, I still remember reading this upstairs in my mother's house, I think when I was home from grad school visiting, when I was reading super training. I had this light bulb moment, this epiphany, where I was reading this book, and there was a reference, a study that said that typically isometric exercise only strengthens plus or minus a few degrees, maybe 10 degrees, maybe it was 15 degrees, plus or minus some number of degrees from the position that you're in, unless you do it at the end range of motion, and then it strengthens the entire range of motion. And so this is where these coordination patterns and strength and doing things at the end range really has value because it allows you to express that greater output through an entire range of motion. And then finally, I can say from direct experience with myself and working with other people over the years, there is a strong component of mental toughness, emotional resilience, and I would say even a spiritual component to this. Because this is very similar to if you have martial arts experience or know about how martial arts traditions often have practitioners holding that horse stance, and they'll do it for many minutes in the beginning, and some martial arts practitioners will work up to holding a horse stance for an hour or two. It becomes a meditation. But along the way, there's times where it's very challenging and your muscles are shaking and the brain is saying, we should quit, we should stop, right? It's trying to find excuses. It's trying to get us to stop because it's concerned that we could run out of energy. We could be doing too much, right? We could be exposing ourselves to harm or making ourselves more vulnerable. And so being able to fight through that, being able to have a vision, a goal, being able to care enough about what we're trying to accomplish, that allows us to push through discomfort. That is a huge skill that transfers to any area of life, let alone, of course, sport and athletic performance. Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you're interested in learning more about how NeuFit and the Newbie can impact your life, please visit our website at www.new.fit. That's NEU.fit. So you can learn more about how it might integrate into your professional practice, how you can use it as a patient, and you can also connect with our team there. So there's a really, really interesting, wonderful component here to be able to observe how we respond under stress and how we battle with that, or how we deal with that internal battle or internal struggle around competing desires to continue versus the desire to quit. We can learn a lot about ourselves and we can explore that edge, and eventually we can push through that edge. There's great sayings about the difference between the winners and the losers, or the fearful and the courageous, is not the absence of fear, right? Even the courageous winners still feel fear. They're just willing to deal with it for longer and push further into that space of fear. Whereas the people who succumb to fear and who lose, they're on the same path. They just exit sooner. They get off that path. So it's about being able to push ourselves to that point continuously over and over again, and eventually expand our boundaries of what is possible for us. So there's a lot going on here. Also, in terms of skills that transfer to other areas of life, I think there's a really interesting component here where being in that experience of being in this ERA lunge or push-up where it feels internally chaotic and noisy, and there's all this internal voice saying, we need to quit now, we need to quit now. Amidst all of that internal turmoil and chaos, still being able to send a quality signal to stay in position, continue to execute the action, that's a skill that translates to life. Because I know I can relate to times, I'm sure you can too, times where life, it just seems like a hurricane. It seems like a whirlwind, metaphorically or sometimes literally. It seems like there's all this stuff going on. It can just be so much to handle and feel so overwhelming. And yet if we can stay centered, focus on our objective for where we're going, and take the next right action, even amidst all of that chaos, that is a skill that can allow us to really make something of ourselves in sport and in life. So you can tell by the amount of time and detail that I spent on these that I really find a lot of value here, and that I think these are important and certainly worth your consideration in adding in with yourself or with any patients or clients or athletes that you may work with. So that's a big part of this framework, end range activation. And I spend so much time there because you can also then use those principles. They translate into other areas, right? If you get good at holding basic squat and lunge positions, that transfers to so many activities with locomotion, right? Which is most sports. If you can also do versions of these end range activation in rotational movements that can translate to hitting a baseball, swinging a golf club, etc., stuff like that. So there's a lot of this is a really we talk about the pyramid and the foundation. This is something that really works at that foundation and then also infuses value at other levels of the pyramid. And then it also is a good segue into other movement patterns that I like doing. And so also in super training, Yuri Verkhoshansky, one of the co-authors, is the Soviet scientist who first developed and coined the term plyometrics and developed progressions around plyometrics. And the initial meaning of plyometric was actually landing. It was eccentric. It was dropping and catching a falling load, or catching one's body weight if it meant stepping off a ledge and landing in a squat or landing in a lunge. And so you can see the connection here, where if you're pulling down into an end range activation squat and it looks like an isometric, but you're really actively pulling down lower and lower and lower, you're getting that eccentric contraction. If you step off of a ledge and land in a squat, you're getting that same eccentric contraction in approximately the same position. The only difference is that you're having to create a much higher amount of force, because force equals mass times acceleration. So you have to decelerate the mass of your body in a fraction of a second. So you momentarily, instead of getting a similar amount of force, moderate amount of force spread out over minutes, like in an ERA, you're getting an extremely high amount of force in a fraction of a second in a short period of time, but in the same position with the same, ideally, movement pattern. So those ERAs are good preparation for the quote unquote real or original plyometrics, which is dropping and catching a falling load, or landing and the falling load being one's body weight. So these are really cool and valuable for a few reasons. One is you're learning to absorb and create large amounts of force, which can help. There's a term out there, like people talk about bulletproofing their joints and stuff like that. So the more force one can absorb, the less risk there is of injury, because injury happens when the force exceeds the tissue capacity. So you're increasing your tissue capacity with this. So there's a really cool, resilience and injury risk reduction benefit. There's also a cool neurological nuance here, where we talked earlier about how the nervous system restricts and limits performance in order to protect us. Here, we're actually turning that dynamic on its head, because here, if I step off of a 4-foot box and I'm landing in a squat, my brain is thinking, oh shit, we're in trouble. We're going to hit this ground and we could be injured, unless we activate every single muscle fiber and motor unit available to us and turn that on to really absorb this shock and protect ourselves. So whereas the brain's internal drive for survival and protection often limits performance, here in this one example, it actually causes us to tap into more performance that we otherwise might not be able to tap into. So it kind of flips that whole dynamic on its head in a productive and positive way. And of course, it's up to us to do it responsibly with ourselves or with our athletes or clients, so that we don't go too far too fast and actually create an injury, but we want to build up that resilience over time. And then there's also this notion of the rate of force development. So many times in sport, it's not powerlifting. It's not about reaching peak force so much as it is reaching moderate or near peak force, but quickly. I played ice hockey, and the biggest determinant of success in moving around the ice there was not necessarily always being able to reach top speed, but being able to take those first few steps quickly, to change direction, to race for a puck in the corner, to be able to get it and pass it out to a teammate, or to be able to take a few quick steps to get to the right spot just in time to receive a pass and score a goal and things like that. So it's about, quickness and agility and those different qualities. Of course, top line speed is valuable, more valuable in certain circumstances than in others, but the rate of force development is so valuable. And even in top speed, every time, if you have a 100-meter sprinter running, once they reach top speed after the first 20 or 30 meters, even if they're already at top speed, there still is a significant rate of force development every time their foot hits the ground, because they're having to absorb 7 to 8 times their body weight worth of force by decelerating their body weight against gravity in a fraction of a second. So there is still a rate of force development there. I mean, it's super, super relevant. And this is a great way to train that. So that's a framework there that I hope lands, no pun intended, hope makes sense, that ERA, and then going into the original plyometrics, dropping and landing. There's also a few things that I want to touch on. So one is sprinting and actual sport specific skills. So I want to go back to the SAID principle here. Remember, we talked about jogging on a treadmill versus jogging outside versus sprinting and increasing speed. So there's another good framework here that's a bell curve or an inverted U curve, and this is a common statistical analysis. So just think of a bell or an upside down U, and if you think about it, as you go left to right across here, there's an amount of volume of work that is not enough to create stimulation. Then as you go up the curve, you can reach this optimal amount where you create the right amount of stimulation for adaptation. And then if you keep going beyond that, you've done too much and you lose some of the benefits. And so this is actually an image that I have in my book as well, in chapter 7. And with if you want to work on sprinting speed, I think this is really important to understand that if you want to increase your speed, it's important that you actually run at or near or above your current fastest speed so that you train specific adaptation to impose demand, right? So you harness the SAID principle to your advantage. If you're just jogging or you're just running 400s, you're not going to be hitting that max speed. You're not going to be able to work on speed. Speed is a skill, neurological skill. It can be trained. There's certain genetic ceilings that different people have, right? So some people will be able to achieve more or less improvements in their speed, but it can be trained to a significant degree. And I think, a lot of coaches have said, probably fewer now, but have said, oh, you can't train speed, right? Stuff. So that's proven false. But it is important that you think about, timing sprints and figuring out, being adequately prepared to sprint at or near a max level, and then figuring out how to achieve that peak speed and then recover in between and be able to maintain it. So that you're harnessing the SAID principle when you're doing sprints, because so many times, coaches are having their kids do like wind sprints to punish them at the end of practice, thinking they're getting faster, but they're fatigued and they're only running at 75 or 80% of their max speed. And so think about what they're doing. They're getting good at endurance. They're getting good at maintaining 75% speed for longer periods of time, and sometimes that's valuable, but not if your target is to train max speed. So I want us to think about the SAID principle and how that influences the decisions that we make around exercises and volumes and intensities and stuff like that. I also want to just say a word about cardio, because that's relevant here. When we think about doing, wind sprints for athletes at the end of a practice or something like that, right? We just talked about how that can be, valuable cardiovascular stamina, et cetera, but may not be effective for training maximum speed. So I think there's a lot of great work out there about the value of zone 2 cardio. I was first exposed to this idea by a guy named Phil Maffetone, Maffetone, I believe. And he had his book called Training for Endurance that someone shared with me when I was in my teens. And he had a formula. It was like 180 beats per minute minus your age. So if you're 40 years old, 180 beats minus 40, your age would be 140 beats per minute. So he would talk about just maintaining that range for an hour or two at a time and building, aerobic cardiovascular endurance. And it was a very simple formula that I think was the predecessor for what we now call today zone 2 cardio. And it's kind of a buzzword. And it's a buzzword because it's important, because it's valuable. It's important that we have this kind of quote unquote aerobic base, which in the pyramid I would say is energy systems and stamina and endurance, right? Which is the second rung up on the pyramid. It's important first, if we're going to be running or biking or cycling or doing anything where we have an endurance challenge, that we have the requisite movement and function first. So one thing that I like doing, there's certainly value in zone 2 cardio. And if people are running or biking or swimming and you're getting benefit from that and you're improving over time and your health is improving, you're getting more vitality, or you're maintaining skills that would otherwise drop off as you age, like that's great. Keep doing it. I also really like doing a couple other things for cardio. One is I like doing, more kind of calisthenic or body weight routines where I'm working on mobility and I'm also keeping my heart rate up. because I sort of get that more bang for the buck type of thing happening at once. So I do a warm up routine most days where I'll do 15 or 20 minutes of various joint mobilizations. I'll go through like Cossack squats, which is like lateral lunges, and do some duck walks and do some handstand work and bridges, all these different things. And my heart rate, is up in that kind of zone 2 level during that. And so over time, I start to accumulate some cardiovascular benefit from that. I also walk average of 11 to 12,000 steps per day. If I'm walking the golf course, it'll be higher, or going on a hike, it'll be higher that day. But, goal is at least 11 or 12,000 steps per day. And I get some of those just going around during the day, but I have to be intentional to get steps in. And so I walk around the neighborhood here by my home or office, where when I'm on a call during the day, I'll walk for an hour, and that gets me some extra cardio just built in during the day. So I like to work that in. I like to find ways where that can be worked in sort of as a habit, and worked in without having to feel like it's an extra burden or something I have to do. Of course, going out and hiking and being in nature is wonderful. But I also really like the benefits of getting outside. There's beyond getting the steps in, versus walking on a treadmill, for example. There's also benefits of getting exposed to natural light, which I think generally is like a nutrient, right? There's these different wavelengths of light that have different effects on the body, just like different nutrients do different things for the body. And it's possible to have a deficit in certain wavelengths of light, and getting exposure, basically as much as we can without, getting a sunburn, right? And being responsible there, but, can be helpful. Beginning and end of the day, when there's more infrared, is, it's easier to be out more and there's less risk of sunburn than in the middle of the day when the sun is up higher and UV is high, right? And all that. But getting out in the light, getting light exposure, getting fresh time in the fresh air has a lot of value beyond just the cardio benefits. So there's that. And then a final point, there's ways to incorporate, if you do have a newbie device, ways to incorporate the newbie in this. There's, muscle hypertrophy work, stimulating and strength work, stimulating the muscles that are your target muscles at those middle frequency ranges, where you're going to be increasing motor unit activation. Like we talked about, how increasing motor unit activation is one of the goals of training. This can allow you to do it, but without as much having to lift as heavy of weights and have as much strain or load on the joints, as much risk of injury or re-injury. So that can slot in during a return to play continuum when you want to start introducing this type of stimulus, but are reticent of increasing external load too much for that risk of re-injury. Or it can make this type of training accessible to people who can't really strength train because of they have, because of previous injuries, because of pain, because they don't have the mobility, or it wouldn't be safe for them to lift weights, or osteoporosis or osteopenia, or stuff like whatever it might be, right? It can start to make this more accessible, or they have MS and it's difficult to even move in some of those ranges of motion. So there's ways where this can start to make strength training more accessible. Of course, different than athletic performance, but in the athletic performance realm, this is where using a tool like the newbie allows us to really fine tune this process of neuromuscular education. It can be like very precisely programming software, where if you're trying to work on, hip extension, for example, you can actually set a frequency to create more contraction in the glute, and then a different frequency to create more of that eccentric, quote unquote, relaxation, which of course we now know is really eccentric contraction in the muscles on the anterior side of that hip, in the psoas, in the rec fem, in the TFL. So you can start to really precisely work on some of these in terms of internal hip rotation. You can actually contract the TFL while you lengthen the glute, or eccentrically, right? Relax and permit greater eccentric contraction of the glute. So there's really cool ways to use technology like the newbie to amplify some of these effects, to tap into the specific adaptation that you're looking for, to get very precise in that level of programming. And so as we wind down here, I hope this, one, felt like a bit of a coherent framework, and two, inspires you to think about how to look at training through the lens of the nervous system. Because if it's not neurologically stimulating enough, there's no reason for the nervous system to get better. Remember, it is like a muscle, where the nervous system can get better if we challenge it appropriately, But just like muscle can atrophy, right? So our nervous system, if not used appropriately, use it or lose it applies. And neuroplasticity also has a dark side. Dun, dun, dun. Dark side as well. So that is all I had for you today. I would love to hear what of this you're either already doing and how it's working, or what you feel inspired to begin doing based on this. Of course, if there's any questions, please feel free to leave comments on Instagram or YouTube. And I look forward to interacting with you. And I'm grateful to be able to be here with all of you in NeuFit Nation. Thanks so much for tuning in. Please like, subscribe, all the things there, and we will see you on the next episode.